media this Sunday, President Trump now calls the media America's greatest enemy. That according to an interview with two of his closest outside advisors who have their own indictment of the press. Corey Lewandowski and Dave Bossie will be here. Media mania as Michael Cohen pleads guilty to lying to Congress over his role in planning a Trump Tower project in Moscow during the campaign. And the press calls him a threat to the president.
He's a weak person, and what he's trying to do is get a reduced sentence. So he's lying about a project that everybody knew about.
The president of the United States has been lying to the American people for years now, lying that he was ever doing any business with the foreign power, which was at the same time committing criminal acts to help get him elected president.
Now, given Cohen's history of mistruths, let's put it that way, the question is, was he lying to Congress then, or is he lying to Mueller now?
This deal, guess what? It never, ever, ever happened. The project never got off the ground. No Trump Organization investments were ever made, and today the Trump Organization has no buildings in Russia. You wouldn't know it if you were watching the mainstream media.
It was in the works at a time when the president said he had no business with Russia, no investments. Not doing the deal doesn't excuse the president from lying about trying to get a deal done.
Are the pundits siding with Michael Cohen against his former boss? This as Paul Manafort and Julian Assange denounce a report in The Guardian about their supposedly secret meetings, with WikiLeaks vowing to sue the paper. And the media say the president has signaled a possible pardon as Manafort's plea deal blows up, while the New York Times reveals his lawyer was secretly briefing the Trump team about his talks with prosecutors.
There is the President of the United States. There he is, committing the crime of obstruction of justice in plain sight. He is willfully obstructing Robert Mueller's pursuit of justice in the Manafort case.
Robert Mueller's prosecutors are instead threatening elderly men with life in prison for petty crimes that have nothing to do with spying or Russia or anything else that threatens America. The whole thing is a grotesque joke.
With Trump telling the New York Post that a Manafort pardon isn't off the table, is the media chatter justified? Plus, the legacy of George Herbert Walker Bush, a president whose re-election slogan was annoy the media, but in the end was celebrated by the media. I'm Howard Kurtz, and this is Media Buzz. There's a lot to get to on the coverage of Michael Cohen's guilty plea, but I want to start with this question of media credibility. The Guardian story about Paul Manafort looked like a bombshell, and it sure was treated that way on television.
We begin with a new report that Paul Manafort, the president's former campaign chairman, paid secret visits, multiple ones, to Julian Assange at the Ecuadorian embassy in London. This is according to The Guardian.
If the story was true, it meant that Manafort met with Julian Assange as a Trump campaign official in 2016, months before WikiLeaks did that massive dump of Democratic emails hacked by Russian operatives. But this was followed by vociferous denials, Manafort calling the story totally false and deliberately libelous. Assange said the alleged meetings never happened. Quote, "Remember this day when The Guardian permitted a serial fabricator to totally destroy the paper's reputation." And WikiLeaks says it is willing to bet The Guardian $1 million and its editor's head that Manafort never met Assange. WikiLeaks now raising money online to sue the London paper. Joining us to analyze the coverage, Jillian Turner, a Fox News correspondent and former White House official in 2 administrations. Emily Jashinsky, culture editor at The Federalist. And Jessica Tarlov, senior editor at Bustle and a Fox News contributor. Okay, Jillian, the part about the editor's head was creepy. But yes. I have a lot of respect for The Guardian, which won a Pulitzer 4 years ago for reporting on leaked NSA documents. But this story with the fierce denials seems a bit thin.
Even if The Guardian was Us Weekly, I would still go with that reporting, because your choices here are, in terms of believability and trust, are between Paul Manafort, WikiLeaks, and, Outlet 3. No matter who Outlet 3 is, I'm going with them.
Well, Manafort, of course, is an admitted liar. Now, I doubt, Emily, we're going to see this $1 million bet by Julian Assange. Should the media have been more cautious about running with this? Because if it's true, as Julian says, it would be potentially devastating, tying the Trump camp to WikiLeaks. But if it's true, I mean, you got all the people involved saying it absolutely is not untrue.
Right, and to Jillian's point, I think that's very fair. You know, Paul Manafort is not necessarily the most honest man in Washington. That being said, the intensity of their denials, I think, is well worth noting, because this is something that, if it is true, there should be video footage. There should be evidence of travel. There should be plenty of evidence that if you were doubling down this hard, you're going to look really dumb. And so there's reports that the Washington Post, the New York Times were trying to confirm the Guardian story. That did not happen. The Guardian later softened its story a little bit to add things like sources say, apparent, etc. Yes, so I think that the story didn't prove to be the bombshell that the media eagerly wanted it to be immediately. I'm sorry to jump in. I just have to clarify before everybody kills me online. I'm not saying that I believe that Paul Manafort went into the embassy and met with them. What I'm saying is that if my choices are between the three of them, I believe the Guardian has by far the most credibility.
In fairness, Jessica, some outlets reported this and said it was unconfirmed or we couldn't confirm it.
Right.
But there is an assumption that Manafort was lying, except I still can't figure out how he could get 3 times into the Ecuadorian embassy without anybody knowing.
No, I lived in London for 6 years. I was on CCTV probably 23 hours of my day, and that's how London is. There should be records of this. At the same time, the Guardian is
surveillance in the city of London.
The surveillance system in the city of London, which they are famous for and have been fighting terrorism very effectively with for years now. There should be records of it, but at the same time, the Guardian, as you pointed out, is an incredibly reputable outlet. They stand by their story. Yes, it has softened a bit, but they say that they do have sources on this. We see how it plays out. But I would say that the journalists who were reporting it were saying, according to the Guardian, this wasn't, CNN running with it and not, saying this is who came up with it. So I think it is fair, certainly, to bring it up. And on the same week that we find out that Paul Manafort violated his plea deal, again, I'm going with Jillian here.
We'll come back to that. But let me turn to this incredible media mob scene in Manhattan. We'll put that up on the screen. And Michael Cohen, this sort of came out of the blue, pleading guilty a second time in a second case to lying to Congress. There we go. Now, this was treated, Jillian, as a bombshell. With liberal pundits were saying, well, the president's former fixer has finally nailed him. This, of course, having to do with Cohen's role in pursuing Trump Tower project in Moscow. And conservatives are just following the president's lead and saying, hey, look, he's twice admitted lying in 2 different cases. How can you believe him?
Well, Cohen has managed to do something that really not many people have been able to do, which is put President Trump on the defensive. I think now the media smells blood in the water, and so they're all over this like white on rice. It's like a very, I would say, compromised or vulnerable position for President Trump to be in. His defense now is actually Michael Cohen's a liar. It's very hard to backtrack going from somebody you once called a brilliant, trustworthy, terrific guy to calling him a liar.
Well, Cohen's version, Emily, is that he's decided to stop lying when he decided to sort of come clean and cooperate with Robert Mueller. And the media consensus accurate when it's the following. If he's telling the truth, then we already knew that the Trump organization was pursuing a real estate project in Moscow through January 2016, just before the primaries and caucuses start. Now it's supposedly through June of 2016 when he's winning the nomination. And that's now according to Michael Cohen. And then BuzzFeed has additional detail that, well, Vladimir Putin was promised would have been promised a $50 million condo in the building to help attract rich Russians.
If that story is true, and that's the whole thing with this line is important. I think it's important that, and President Trump said this week, it's not as though nobody knew about this deal. So while he's calling Michael Cohen a liar, he's also saying this deal was pretty widely known at the time. If it goes into June and we have the president on the record saying X, Y, and Z, I have no deals in Russia, I'm not doing...
He said that many
times.
times.
That's important, but at the same time, it is not colluding with the Russian government. Both of those things can be true.
I think the media consensus, I didn't mean to jump on you there, is that, well, he now would have a motive to cooperate with Russia if he was trying to do this deal. And yes, we knew about it, but the president says, look, I was a businessman. There's a good chance I wouldn't win. This was my business, and so what's wrong with my pursuing such a project, which, by the way, never went anywhere?
Well, there are 2 issues at play. There's one, the lying, saying multiple times, I have no business dealings in Russia whatsoever, which we know is not true. We have pictures of the whole Trump family out there in Moscow wearing their furs. We know this deal was happening. If there was a $50 million apartment promised to Vladimir Putin, that is actually a violation of our laws.
When you say this deal was happening, I mean, it didn't
It was
happen.
being pursued, and you have Ivanka on email talking about an architect.
Okay.
I mean, everyone was involved in there, and they were not supposed to. And for you to say, oh, it could be a business deal, it had nothing to do with the government, nothing in Russia gets done without Vladimir Putin on that level. So it's not like doing a deal in America and the President of the United States not being involved. Vladimir Putin controls every single thing that happens there because it's a dictatorship. So
But that doesn't mean that we've had evidence, concrete evidence arise that the Trump campaign in and of itself was colluding with the Russian government.
No, I don't think anyone's claiming that, but
Right.
it's potentially a significant advance, but it comes down to this question of, do you believe Michael Cohen now? But not all the reporting on this has been 100% accurate. Emily, NPR reporting that Donald Trump Jr., the president's son, contradicted Cohen by saying, oh, the discussions about any deal ended in 2014. He was talking about a different deal, and he is on record as having discussed the fact that they were pursuing this Moscow project in 2015, in 2016. NPR kind of pulled it back. No apology, no full correction. We mischaracterized what Don Jr. said.
Yeah, the update they added to their story, I think, was ridiculous. I think the story should have been retracted. This was an incredible blunder because what they ended up updating their story to reflect was in the transcript that they were working off of. It was readily available. You could read it. It didn't take, Molly Hemingway at the Federalist herself, it didn't take her that long to connect the dots here and get a story put together showing that NPR's narrative here was easily disputed in the transcript. It shows shoddy reporting and that the reporter who put the story together didn't actually bother to read through the whole transcript.
Right. And it was there in plain sight. And Don Jr. has called this a desperate attempt to smear me, a desperate and sloppy attempt. And I think, I'm not saying it was a smear, but man, it was a bad mistake. So coming back to Paul Manafort, the president's former campaign chairman, there was a kind of a media explosion when Mueller said he's violated his plea deal, he's still lying to us, and so forth. And then it really intensified when the New York Times reported, and Rudy Giuliani and others then confirmed, that while he was supposedly cooperating with Mueller, his lawyer was briefing the Trump team's lawyers, and some in the press kind of characterizing Manafort as being a sort of double agent.
Yeah, it was this triangulated deal whereby somehow Paul Manafort's attorneys were hoping to ingratiate him, continue to ingratiate him with the Trump campaign, but also continue to lie to Mueller's team. So sort of have your cake and eat it too, and that's just not really feasible. It also intensified the debate this week with the pardon issue.
And on that point, let me jump in, because we've got the sound queued up.
I don't mean to jump ahead, sorry.
No, it's fine.
I know you hate that, I'm sorry.
You queued it up for me. So the president spoke to the New York Post. He was asked about this by reporters. Let's hear what he had to say.
The question was asked to me by the New York Post, and I said, no, I have not offered any pardons. And I think they asked, or whatever, would you? I said, I'm not taking anything off the table.
So the media interpretation is Trump sending a very clear signal that he could potentially pardon Manafort, and we heard some of the anchors on other channels say he's obstructing justice by even talking about this.
Yeah, well, this goes back to when President Trump has been very nice to Paul Manafort publicly. I remember when he was on trial, he was tweeting, this is terrible. He's a very fine man, very nice man. And the contrast between him and Michael Cohen is stark there.
Because Cohen caved. And at the
Cohen
time,
caved and Paul Manafort, it seems like he isn't. But Judge Napolitano last week was making the case that actually what Bob Mueller has done that's very smart is make Paul Manafort pardon-proof by having federal crimes and state crimes, because President Trump can pardon him on the federal level, but can't on the state level.
Well, regardless of whether that will happen, Emily, what do you make of the pardon coverage? Do you think it's a fair reading of the president's comments in an interview, or do you think it's set off just wild speculation?
Well, I think the speculation about obstruction of justice is too far. I mean, I don't think that this constitutes obstruction of justice. I think Jessica is right to point to the contrast between Michael Cohen and Paul Manafort, and that this is a president who clearly values loyalty, and to the extent that he's treating them differently, that's a real story. But to say that this constitutes obstruction of justice, I think, of course,
I think the media, though, is saying it's unethical for the president to be commenting about a potential pardon, period. And that's a reasonable position to take. President Bush was bombarded with media questions last few years of his administration about pardoning Scooter Libby.
Yeah.
He said, I'm not commenting.
The president could have deflected the question, but let's just say that that is not his style. Oh, by the way, President taking a lot of flack for retweeting this picture, if we can put it up quickly, when the trials for treason began. Again, he was just retweeting it, but we see there Barack Obama, Bill Clinton, but also Rod Rosenstein, Bob Mueller. Kind of a unique thing for a president to do. Ahead.
So kind, Howie.
Corey Lewandowski and Dave Bossie on whether the media are, in Donald Trump's words, America's greatest enemy. But when we come back, there's been an outpouring of journalistic praise since George H.W. Bush's passing. But the tone was very different when he was president. Brit Hume joins us next. The papers today are filled with glowing tributes to George Herbert Walker Bush after his death in '94. Washington Post, public servant and statesman, New York Times using the same picture, a genial force in American politics. So many other special sections and articles and praise, but it wasn't always this way. Joining us now, Brit Hume, Fox's senior political analyst who covered him in the White House. And Brit, what do you make of the contrast between just, bipartisan praise across the media landscape, across the political landscape, and that famous bumper sticker from 1992, I think we've got a picture of the then president holding it up, annoy the media, re-elect Bush?
Well, the media were very hard on him when he was president, even as he was running for re-election. There was about it, Howard, a kind of an issue that it was a certain reverse snobism in the media. George Bush was the blue blood aristocrat from a New England family who, went into politics. And he was looked at on the media with a certain condescension because he'd been such a silent and utterly loyal figure under Reagan and had filled all these different jobs. And he wasn't a terribly talented public speaker.
Right, he was no Reagan.
And he was thought to be a man. Yeah, he was thought he paled in comparison to Reagan, although there were times when he could be extremely articulate. Mm-hmm. But think of what he inherited, Howard. I mean, it is said that he had no vision, but what was happening when he became president was the vision of many who had come before him was coming to fruition. The collapse of the Soviet Union, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the rest of it. And his job was to manage that skillfully to make sure it didn't fall apart, which he did.
Which history has recorded that he did. Now, when Vice President Bush was running, there was this 1998 interview with 1988 interview that ended up being half the CBS News with Dan Rather. It got very testy over Iran and Iran-Contra. Let's take a quick look.
It's not fair to judge my whole career by a rehash on Iran. How would you like it if I judged your career by those 7 minutes when you walked off the set in New York? Well, now, would you like that?
That was a sort of a protest by Rather. So Bush could be feisty when he was provoked.
Yeah, he was a competitor, Howard. He didn't have a mean bone in his body, but he was a competitor who would, within limits, do what he had to do to deal with the task at hand. And the task at hand for him then, of course, was getting elected and assuring the Republican base that he had some steel in him. And Dan Rather was not a popular figure on the American right. And when he took him on in the way he did in that interview, encouraged by our founder at Fox News, the late Roger Ailes, it rallied people behind him. The people in the Republican base really liked that interview and thought he'd done well at it.
Right. Roger Ailes then working for candidate George Bush. And this also came up in this infamous Newsweek cover, which was called, the headline was, "Fighting the Wimp Factor." This guy was a World War II hero, and yet this was the meme that Newsweek immortalized. So he had a lot to overcome in terms of the media's conception of him.
And Howard, he was the youngest naval aviator ever when he enlisted as a young man prior to going to college, which he could certainly have done. But he chose to enlist, and he was shot down over the Pacific, Chichijima Island, and rescued in the nick of time by an American submarine. That's not the behavior of a wimp. And it persisted nonetheless. And even after he was out of office, 1995, Maureen Dowd, writing in the New York Times, she never cared for Bush, described him as Bertie Wooster, the silly British aristocratic character of the comic novels by P.G. Wodehouse. That image of him persisted. And this was after he had managed the collapse of the Soviet Union, after he had mounted the coalition that won the Gulf War in a walkover, and he'd achieved quite a lot, but nonetheless it persisted. And it's that kind of reverse snobism about class that you see that permeates the media. Now you see the media exemplifying it in a somewhat different way toward Donald Trump.
Well, that's right. Drawing that contrast that he's now a useful foil. We have less than a minute, Britt, but since you covered that White House, what was it like to deal with George Bush personally?
Well, he knew us all because he'd been around forever, all of us who covered him at the time. He was exceedingly friendly to us as he was to everyone. And he had a real blessing in a way because he has a forgiving spirit. And so he endured these slings and arrows from the media, and with only a handful of exceptions, he was forgiving about it, and he didn't stay mad at people for very long, and I think that helped him a lot. And his press relations really weren't bad. His news conferences were fairly frequent and orderly, and so he basically did fine. And I want to add one other thing, Howard, and it was during the run-up to the Gulf War. He had a lot of meetings with the press, many of them impromptu, and he became in that moment, Howard, extraordinarily articulate and precise in his discourse, which we'd not seen that of him before.
Right,
but it was a remarkable display of what he could do when he had to, and he did then.
He rose to that occasion,
and he was nice.
Well, that counts for a lot, particularly in today's toxic politics. But we've got to leave it there.
It does.
Britt, thanks so much. Great to see you.
You bet.
Ahead, Corey Lewandowski and Dave Bossie are openly attacking never-Trump conservatives in the press in very personal terms. But up next, the media debate over the caravan changes dramatically after an attack on Border Patrol agents. The media consensus was that President Trump hugely hyped the migrant caravan in Mexico to rile up his base during the midterms. But last weekend, a number of migrants charged an entry point near San Diego and attacked Border Patrol agents with rocks, seriously injuring 3 of them. More than 40 migrants were arrested on the U.S. side. But much of the coverage focused on the agents' use of tear gas to push the attackers back.
If you've caught any news about the border crisis in the last 24 hours, you have been subjected to a disgusting and blatant attempt at emotional manipulation.
We know that the president thinks that using tear gas on children looks bad. There is no reason to assume that Donald Trump actually believes that it is bad to use tear gas on children.
I am ashamed. This tear gas choked me. We treat these people, these economic refugees, as if they're zombies from The Walking Dead.
Jillian Turner, I was quite surprised to hear Lawrence O'Donnell say, well, maybe Trump is fine with tear gassing women and children. But that Reuters photo, if we can put it up, of the Honduran woman and her 2 daughters, even if they were innocent bystanders, it went viral, and it certainly gave plenty of fuel to the president's critics.
I mean, that looks, the idea that this is near the American border is quite shocking, frankly. Mm-hmm. But I think the caravan issue at large is something the media continues to get wrong on all sides. It's been this fault line issue. People believe that it's either a national security threat of epic proportions or it's a humanitarian crisis. And nobody makes any room for anything in between or anything that accommodates both. It's very difficult sometimes for, I think, the media to accept the idea that more than one reality or one truth can be evident at a time, and that sometimes things are not so clear-cut.
Right. Polarized coverage certainly contributes to that. And on that point, Emily Jashinsky, it's not wrong to say that President Trump heavily pushed the caravan and immigration in general as an issue to get his voters out during the midterms. That may be true. But doesn't this attack show that the media's dismissive approach, at least most outlets, that the caravan was nothing, wasn't entirely right?
Right. That narrative fell apart, I think, and we saw that in a really upsetting way. I mean, those images are nauseating. They're obviously compelling. You cannot blame the press for disseminating them. Mm-hmm. It's something that we should all be aware of. At the same time, there were several years over the course of the Obama administration where tear gas was used around 20 times. This has been happening at our border. People have thrown, in fact...
That didn't get mentioned much.
No, and people have thrown rocks and bottles at the border before. This is something that's been happening for years. This was an obvious flare-up. It was hard to watch, hard to look at. But the narrative that this caravan posed no threat to the United States border would never arrive, and if it did, it would be very few people, just did not come to pass, and the media, of course, never reflected on that.
Jessica Tarlow, some press accounts did make clear that the Border Patrol agents were using the tear gas after they were attacked by these rock-throwing migrants. But others kind of fudged it, almost as if to suggest they have no right to defend themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a very difficult position, I think, to be in when you have picked a certain point of view, and certainly if it's your party's alignment, then you have to go with that. I know that for myself as a liberal opposition voice, often surrounded by conservatives, that if I show any weakness in an argument that I'm making, then that gets seized upon.
Right.
And that's why I think that the Gang of Eight, for instance, and the Gang of Six had so much trouble getting their bills passed because the other sides, the partisans out there, said, well, we can't have any compromise here because that lets down our base that feels a certain way about it.
Is that reflected in a polarized media, which either says the caravan is fearsome or the caravan is harmless?
I think it's absolutely the case. You know, for a while, when the estimates were they're arriving around Christmas time, mid-December, I felt perfectly fine saying, you guys are being crazy, it's a humanitarian crisis, they won't be here for months, and this is an election issue. Then you see law enforcement being attacked by a small minority, but you are forced to acknowledge it because no one should be getting rocks or bottles in the face for doing their job, but that doesn't change the fact that it is a humanitarian crisis. I'm
glad we got some nuance, brought some nuance to the coverage. Jillian Turner, Emily Jasinski, Jessica Tarloff, thanks very much for being with us this Sunday. Ahead on Mediabuzz, CNN fires a contributor over a speech many view as calling for Israel's destruction. But first, Corey Lewandowski, there he is, and Dave Bossie on why they say most of the media is allied with the Democrats. With the war between the president and the special counsel heating up, we turn now to perhaps Donald Trump's most influential outside advisors. And they have a very harsh indictment of the media in their new book. Joining us now from Manchester is Corey Lewandowski, Trump's former campaign manager and advisor to Vice President Pence's PAC. And here in Washington, David Bossie, the president's former deputy campaign manager and a Fox News contributor. The book is Trump's Enemies: How the Deep State is Undermining the Presidency. Corey, CNN's Jeff Toobin, after the Michael Cohen plea and the Manafort business, said on air Donald Trump might not finish his term in office. Are the media, in pouncing on what Michael Cohen and Paul Manafort have done, depicting a kind of a prosecutorial noose tightening around the president's neck?
Howie, this is amazing. CNN does not have one on-air talent that could be considered a conservative. They have gone so far to the left that their only message now is to go after the president. What Michael Cohen has pled to was lying to Congress, which nobody told him to do but himself. You know, CNN ran wall-to-wall coverage about a meeting that Paul Manafort supposedly took with Julian Assange, which now we find out actually never happened. CNN, MSNBC, and the mainstream media has Trump derangement syndrome.
Well, we don't know for sure the Assange meeting didn't happen, but as we talked about earlier, I'm not sure the Guardian has proven his case. I know, Dave, you have very strong feelings about Michael Cohen's credibility, but isn't it also true that the president, who you admire, hired Michael Cohen and hired Paul Manafort and hired Michael Flynn and hired Rick Gates, all of whom have now pled guilty to lying and other crimes?
But the crimes, Howie, have nothing to do with the president.
I wasn't suggesting that.
No, I know that. But
the
CNNs and MSNBCs and the wall-to-wall Trump derangement syndrome reporters that cover Washington, that cover this president, want to jumble it all up and make the narrative to the American people that these all have something to do with the Russia collusion investigation. They do not. This president has nothing to do with Paul Manafort prior to his campaign. The same thing. Look, Michael Cohen pled guilty to wire fraud and bank fraud related to a taxi cab company in New York City.
That was
nothing
the
to
first
do, but nothing to do with the president. Paul Manafort, wire fraud and hiding money overseas and lying to the IRS over business deals, 10 years before the campaign.
I get that much of the cases don't involve Trump or the Trump organization, but Corey, in your book, you guys both sat for an interview with the president, and he said to you that fake news, which of course he's attacked, what he calls fake news, is the greatest enemy in this country. Greater than terrorists, greater than gang members? That going a little far?
Look, Howie, there is a cabal of the fake news. When I look at Jennifer Rubin of the Washington Post, who supposedly claims to be a conservative, which is such a farce, she's the last thing from a conservative. Bill Kristol, who is supposed to be a conservative, attacks this president because he doesn't like his delivery method.
Okay, I'm going to come back to that, but address the greatest enemy part, because that's a pretty serious charge.
Look, Howie, these people have all gotten together to attack this president for nothing. The fake news has stirred up the American people, and what this president has done is he's pointed out how fake their stories are. The media members don't want to report the news. They want to be the news. We've seen that with Jim Acosta, and there is never an apology. Jim Acosta went on TV and said that this caravan was never coming. They were going to be hundreds of miles away. Go ask the people on the border who have rocks thrown at them if the caravan is there. These guys are the fake news, and this president's done a good service by calling them out.
Dave, the president also told you guys it's hard to defend yourself, except on social media, of what is an overwhelmingly negative amount of coverage. he is the biggest bullhorn in the world, so it shouldn't be that hard for him to defend himself. And he
does it every day, and he needs to do it. And what happens is this media narrative by the left-wing media in this country, this vast left-wing conspiracy that is out to destroy this president. They tried to defeat him during the campaign. They tried to delegitimize him during the transition, and now they're trying to run him out of town, through impeachment. It is going to be a very tough next 2 years because the American people, instead of being able to get things done for the American people, the president and the White House is going to be under siege by this left-wing Congress.
Well, for the record, we haven't gotten to impeachment yet, if we ever do. But, Corey, now whenever we read something that you and Bossy wrote on your own. The press trades on the emotions of their audience. The more they stir them up, the more they get them to buy their newspapers, tune into their channels, or click on their websites. And that's true. It's true on both the left and the right, in my view. But doesn't the president, like many other politicians, also play on the emotions of the voters? Why single the press out?
Because the press is in this to obviously make money, and what they want to do is the more salacious the story, the more the press talks about it. Look, Howie, you talked about it earlier on your show today. The Guardian story, it became the fodder for 24 or 48 hours about whether Paul Manafort ever went to London to do a meeting. Nobody did any homework on this. Nobody's been held accountable. Look, Paul's a very bad guy. He's going to spend a lot of time in jail for a lot of crimes that he committed that had nothing to do with the campaign. But somebody, media outlets, should have verified this story before they just ran with the Guardian story, because they want clickbait, and that's what happens. So the president has to use his megaphone to push back on these fake stories, or else the American people think it's just true.
And by the way, this story is now days old. Nobody in the mainstream media, the garbage that they continue to put out there on this Julian Assange meeting.
It's hard to disprove a story.
No, Howie. London has incredible security cameras. The embassy where this meeting was supposed to happen, security cameras. The media stakes this place out all the time.
All right,
there would be one piece, one shred of evidence if this meeting actually happened, and not one person after nearly a week has been able to say that it happened.
All right, quick question for you, Dave, before we go to break, and then we'll continue. You guys write that the media are little more than the public relations arm of the Democrat Party.
That's right.
I get that there's bias. I get that there's unfairness. I get that there are stories that are wrong, but PR for the Democrats?
Yeah, Howie, the New York Times, the CNN, MSNBC, they are super PACs for the Democrat Party.
The New York Times broke the Hillary Clinton email story. That doesn't sound like a super PAC to me.
No. Howie, look, let's be real. They have to write stories, and they do write stories that are factually based. But if you look at the totality of their coverage, they have been so predominantly negative. 90% of the coverage in the New York Times, in the Washington Post, are negative. Those stories are negative, and that is what this president's been up against since the first day of his campaign.
You guys seem to have a lot to say, so let's continue the conversation after the break. And later, the text messages revealing the story that media mogul Les Moonves didn't want told. A cover-up of alleged sexual misconduct with an actress 23 years later. More now with Corey Lewandowski and David Bossy on their new book, Trump's Enemies. And Corey, among those enemies, according to you, is the White House leakers, people around the president who dump out stuff, making him or their colleagues look bad. You guys are right. They get seduced by the press, inundated with calls. They're stars for the first time in their lives. Is that why the White House is such a leaky place?
Well, I think that's part of it. And look, these people who are nobodies before coming to the Trump administration all of a sudden get courted by the media, tell them that they want to have them on TV. They become stars, and all of a sudden they think that they're the show, and they're not. And look, what we've seen and what Bob Woodward's book pointed out was Rob Porter and Gary Cohn and others were literally taking documents off the president's desk. Those are enemies not just of the president, but of the American people, because they're stopping his agenda from going forward.
And Dave, you picking up the president's term, the fake news, you say the fake news refuses to report that the stock market is booming under Trump or about record low unemployment numbers. Now, leaving aside the recent downturn in the market, there's been plenty of coverage about the stock market going way up. I think what you're really arguing is that you don't think Donald Trump gets enough credit
Certainly. You look at his list of accomplishments over the last 2 years of his presidency, it has been unbelievable, whether it's on economic policy, domestic policy, or foreign policy.
But you say refuses to report.
And
Isn't that
that's
an overstatement?
Look, it's not an overstatement. This president does not get the credit that he deserves. The mainstream media's narrative is all about this fake Russia collusion story. They eat up column inches to sell newspapers and get clicks, and they don't talk about the good things that this president does on a daily basis for all Americans. When the economy goes up, that helps all Americans. When we're safer at home and abroad, that helps all Americans. And they play divisive politics every single day.
Corey, let me come back to something you alluded to in the earlier segment, and this is from your book. Turncoat Republicans and former Republicans have flooded our airwaves with hatred for President Trump. And you go through the list: Bill Kristol, jealous, angry, clownish political activist; Jennifer Rubin, you mentioned; George Will; Bret Stephens of the New York Times; Nicole Wallace desperately wants to be loved by the Trump-hating viewers at MSNBC. Why can you not just say that these are Republicans or ex-Republicans who completely disagree with Trump, as opposed to disparaging them in such harsh fashion?
Because they have such a hatred for this president that they can't see past that hatred. Look, these were supposed to be the individuals who wanted a conservative president to come here. And calling Jennifer Rubin a conservative columnist or blogger for the Washington Post is like calling Ana Navarro a conservative. It is such a scam. These people should be called out for what they are, which are hypocrites. Donald Trump has been the most conservative president since Ronald Reagan, or even before. When you look at the Nonpartisan Heritage Foundation, who said what he's been able to accomplish in the first 2 years puts him on par ahead of Ronald Reagan, he should be praised by the conservatives. But Bill Kristol, Jennifer Rubin, all these guys, they're clowns, and they were supposed to be conservatives, but they're using their hatred of Donald Trump to further their own agenda and to have their own political philosophy put out front, which is they hate Trump.
But what they would say, David Bossie, is that they are sticking to their principles.
H.W. Bush this weekend, a lifelong leader, dedicated public servant, and family man. House Republicans tangle with Jim Comey over answering questions on Capitol Hill this week, and the U.S. and China strike a temporary truce on trade. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here. I'm Maria Bartiromo. This is Sunday Morning Futures. Tributes have been pouring in for the 41st President of the United States as our nation prepares to honor George H.W. Bush this week. And we learn new details about the funeral arrangements coming up. We will get reflections from the man President Bush chose as his running mate. Former Vice President Dan Quayle joins me now in an exclusive interview coming up. A judge could decide tomorrow whether James Comey will appear publicly or privately before lawmakers on Capitol Hill. Will House Republicans finally get the answers they've been seeking for nearly 2 years? I'll speak exclusively with House Judiciary Committee Chairman Bob Goodlatte. And President Trump and Xi strike a tentative deal on trade just a day after the American president signed a new trade with the leaders of Mexico and Canada. Will Democrats work with the president in the wake of these negotiations? An incoming member of the House Democratic leadership, Congressman Matt Cartwright, is with me talking about that and the possibility of a partial government shutdown on the horizon as we look ahead right now on Sunday Morning. War hero and 41st President of the United States died on Friday night at the age of 94. He is being remembered as a man of uncommon decency and kindness across the political spectrum this weekend. A loving father and husband who devoted his life to his family and country. Beginning tomorrow, the nation will get to say their final farewells to the former president when he lie in state in the U.S. Capitol before he is laid to rest back home in Texas later this week. Joining me right now in an exclusive interview to share his memories of the late president is Dan Quayle, former vice president under George H.W. Bush. Mr. Vice President, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Good morning.
My condolences to you and his family. Share with us what you remember of President H.W.
Well, you said it all. The best. And it was such an honor for me to work with him every single day that he was president, I was vice president, for the American people. And a lot of folks, they ask me, well, what's the legacy? I said, that's a tough question. Historians will sort that out. But in my view, his legacy, Maria, was accomplishments. He got things done. When he left office, the economy was growing at 5-6%. The Berlin Wall came down. Eastern and Central Europe freed from the of communism. Apartheid in South Africa was eliminated. To Iraq, North time and West Africa was eliminated. Success in putting Saddam Hussein back into Iraq, Noriega apprehended. So many things in a short period of time, and the domestic front as well. So accomplishments. He did so much in 4 years.
He really did. He left the country in a better place than when he arrived. And when he first chose you as his running mate, you wrote an op-ed in the Journal. George Bush, Be Prepared and Be Loyal was the title of that. You talked about after yourself and the president were inaugurated on January 20th, 1989, and he discussed Ronald Reagan a bit to you. As Ronald Reagan left, why did you choose those words, be prepared and loyal? He said that to you.
He did. We talked about, what the Quayle model would be. I said, look, I very much like the Bush model. And he says, no, you have your own model. You'll do your thing. It'll be different than mine. I was very, very fortunate to not only work with him as a great individual, but he had been vice president for 8 years. And he knew the good things about being vice president and the not so good things about being vice president. So that was a blessing from my perspective. But what he said to me on the steps of the Capitol as we said goodbye to Ronald Reagan and Nancy Reagan, he turned to me and in sort of his low voice, he says, that man was very good to me. And I can say that today, that man, George Bush, was very good to me.
Oh, how wonderful. And you were just 41 years old when you first were in the job, but you had been in Congress for a long time, since you were 29, so you had a great perspective in terms of the congressional dealings. How did President Bush deal with the Congress in terms of the different factions and determinations on each sides of the aisle?
Well, it's interesting because we had a Democrat Congress. So, we had to deal with Speaker Foley. We had to deal with Majority Leader George Mitchell.